Hello everyone, and welcome to our first Biggening Corporation recap. We'll try to keep this short and catch everyone up. If you have not watched the summary of this, we are using Business Central as an engine to create an online game where players will run virtual corporations competing against each other to see who wins each season based on wealth generation. The only way that players will be able to interact with the Business Central system is to manage the bots who will work in BC, posting transactions and doing all sorts of things. All of the development is done live on Twitch on weekday evenings, European time, and uploaded to YouTube after. The code is always available in GitHub, sometimes the next day, admittedly. But once the alpha version 1.0 is online, players will be invited to compete in the very first season, and the sign up can be found on the GitHub page. So, to recap this relatively quickly for everyone, in our first episode we were going over the specification, which you will find in GitHub as well under the documentation folder. We built our very first set of tables around bot templates, and we were testing out intercompany events, where of course we found that they don't work for what we need. So we then dove into what company setup we will need to have in every player company, and then in our third episode we began to create the table infrastructure necessary for instances of bots, and we started to make some of the basic role centers for players. Then we talked a little bit more in depth about some of the gotchas hiding in the specification and how they relate specifically to the bot purchase wizard, and that outlined some of the goals for our next several episodes. Finishing up the bot purchasing wizard, we went ahead and worked on how the bots are going to get created from the wizard, and we had our first bots exist. Then we needed to also talk a little bit about config packages. We are going to make use of some config packages to generate things like a random name pool for customers and vendors. And finally, we wrapped up the episode by creating the engine that would become the heartbeat of the system, and dove right back into the next episode to listen for those heartbeats, initially trying to use some intercompany tables and intercompany events, and finding that does not do what we need to do, and instead we used an intercompany system for watching from the job queue. To test that this was working, we went for the simplest thing, which was to create the power usage ledger, since all bots will require power. And finally, with that all in place, we built the bot dispatch engine. The dispatcher is going to iterate through on each heartbeat signal all of the bots of the system, and to safely manage the bot infrastructure we needed to have an error-safe framework so that the job queue did not error out, and that system administrators could find and quickly resolve any issue, as well as allowing players to review what the bots have been up to, and those logs are available as appropriate. In episode 8 we had a little bit of a strange episode, not going into the code at all. We instead focused entirely on planning, outlining some of the differences between what the specification, quote-unquote, says and what we can program. And finally, in the 9th episode, we built a research subsystem skeleton that was creating the template for how research might work, prerequisites and things like that, as well as how players will be able to work with the research engine. In the beginning of episode 10, we had the unusual moment of a time lapse, about a half hour to an hour of coding, condensed down to 3 minutes, going over building some of the setup tables, much as we had others, as well as duplicating the different bot type code units to match our new bot dispatch framework. With that in place, we then dove in on teaching the research bots about how research should work. And with that all completed and going, we wanted to have the ability to manage our players. We wanted to keep track of creating users for players, as well as producing companies for players. In episode 12, we began finally to address the fact that we are eventually going to need a lot of different items in the system, and a fine example that I've had similar ones to in the past of an Excel that makes perfect sense for someone to quickly work with creating items, but is intensely complex to import and cannot be brought in with config packages. So we utilize the Excel buffer and some of the newer list functionality to iterate through multi-dimensional Excel data and produce records from that. We did not skip a slide. There was a small favor to a friend there who has a phobia, and having friends in my life who appreciate greatly video games that have arachnophobia friendly modes, I figure I can only be so kind as to skip a number that makes some people uncomfortable. Our 14th episode, we started with a new tool to me that helps massively with translations called Poedit. Hopefully I am calling that by the correct pronunciation, as well as some of the useful Visual Studio Code extensions that help with translations. Then we started to talk shop a little bit about how CodeCop works, how to enable it, and what the implications would be for our project if we turned it on now. I am intentionally, for a good chunk of the series, leaving it off so that we can get the job done quickly. I am doing this as a spare time project, which, as many of you know, spare time is one of those things that we jokingly refer to as copious. Our 15th episode, we did a little bit of fact-finding to see what the minimum amount of company setup would be to be able to post transactions to receive some items into the system. And we, looking at our spec, reviewed the dangerous concept of automatic. And what does that actually mean? What are the assumptions baked into that? For our 16th episode, we needed to do some cleanup on our system components. For example, the job queue, and when players interact with the system, we need to be on the appropriate game day, which we are using the wonderful workdate functionality to do. Talking a little bit about the plan to move our to-do pile into Trello, which is still ongoing. And then finally, we worked with our purchasing bots to finally have our very first purchase. So, 16th episode was our first transaction made by a bot. And then in our 17th episode, we needed to adjust that flow, as it was mostly hard-coded, to be setup-driven, and start to put in place some of the constraints around players and what they can change on vendor cards. And last, we, for testing's sake, asked our purchase bots to go ahead and do a post, a receive, and invoice so we can see the transactions flowing into the system. Our 18th episode, we also started to teach our purchase bots about how to fish for prospective vendors, meaning when we don't have the bots actively fulfilling orders, we might want them to go find more suppliers. Maybe we need to be able to increase our purchasing leverage, or be able to fulfill more demand. But we also, for balance sake, have prospective vendors have a certain number of items that they will be willing to sell to us, and those we refer to as prospective vendor trades. We also needed a little bit of game setup expansion, so that way we could control in game balance how those fishing odds work out. In our 19th episode, we needed to make functionality to convert those prospective vendors over into vendors themselves, along with populating the setup tables that we will want to have for items and which vendors sell which items. Speaking of, we also wanted to give players some control over the target supply level that should be kept on hand of items. And today, in our 20th episode, we tested out location inventory constraints, looking at the maximum cubage functionality in Business Central, and realized that that only helps us in the warehousing situations, not in basic inventory flow. So, since we need both to function in more smooth ways, we went ahead and built new location constraints to meet our needs, as well as allowing a player a little more insight into what's going on for a location. So that is where we're currently at. Hopefully that catches up some of you and you'll be able to join us for some of the live streams on an ongoing basis. But if not, don't worry, I do plan to do recaps every 10 episodes as a summary to make life a little easier. There will be a separate playlist on my YouTube available for that, and if you follow Twitter you will see updates about that. I encourage you to please go ahead and subscribe, and thank you for watching. Take care.